Excuse me. Hey guys, so today's video is going to talk about intertextuality and the outsiders, which I've already talked about a good bit in the different chapters, but I'm going to go into more depth and try to hit on every example of it, including, I think there's one that I didn't mention while we were doing the book, so I'm going to go back and correct that. This is going to be extremely important to your essay, which I'm also going to talk about at the end of the video today. This is going to be a full 5-paragraph essay that we're going to take about week and a half, 2 weeks to do, so you should have plenty of time on it. It's going to be due Wednesday, May the 7th. I'm sorry, Wednesday, May the 7th on Turnitin. I will go back through and tell you that again towards the end of this video. I'll post that online, but the prompt is going to stay in the video. I don't think I'm going to put the prompt in typed form because I want to make sure that you have to watch the video so that you've got a full understanding of what I'm asking you to do. Also, today, for this weekend's homework, what I want you to do is go ahead and work on your 3-point thesis for the essay, which, again, you will find out the prompt in a few minutes. But today, just so I've got an attendance, I want you to give me, and I'll post the assignment shortly after the video, I want you to give me at least, I'm going to say 2 to 3 sentences, but if you want to give me a couple paragraphs, I'm not going to mind. It's up to you. But minimum is going to be 2 or 3 sentences. We'll say minimum 2. I just want your thoughts on The Outsiders, and that can be, what you thought of the plot and the characters, whether you liked it or not, and why. Now, don't just say, I liked the book, it was good. If you do that, I'm going to not give you full credit because that's not a very good answer. If you say, I liked the book because I thought it gave a lot of depth to the characters and showed the conflict between the Socias and the Greasers in a really interesting way, that's good. That's fine. I'll give you credit for that. And obviously you can go more in depth than that and say more. It's just up to you, but at least a substantial 2 sentences telling me your opinion on the book. I think that's a pretty easy assignment for the day, and that'll be due by midnight tonight, just so we have some attendance. And also, I'm interested in your general opinions. All right, so intertextuality and the outsiders. Obviously, you're seeing my computer screen instead of my face today. I apologize for that. I know how much you all miss seeing my face every day. So, intertextuality, again, I've explained this word, I think, when we did the first chapter. It's where you have a book that references another book or work of art. Some people will tell you that it's just when a book references another book. I don't have a huge problem with that definition, but I extend it a little bit personally, and I know a lot of other people who do. I think when a book references a movie or a song or anything like that, I think that's also an example of intertextuality, and I think it's something that should also be paid similar attention to. So I've carried through that here. And the first example we have is Ponyboy's reference to Paul Newman. Now, this and the second reference to Great Expectations, and I've got page numbers listed here where these things are mentioned. I'm not going to say that I've captured every single moment they're mentioned in the book, but I think I've captured most of them, and especially the important ones. Paul Newman and Great Expectations are kind of one-off references. I'm not saying they're unimportant, because they certainly are, especially with Paul Newman being the first and last lines of the book. But I don't think that there's as much information on them as as you might find on, say, Nothing Gold Can Stay or Gone with the Wind. And there's one other one-off reference that Ponyboy has that we'll get to towards the end. But these references, and I've got them set up in order of first appearance, I believe. I may have Nothing Gold Can Stay and Gone with the Wind flipped in that regard, but it's okay. These references usually, I think, have something to do with the themes and the plot of the novel. Sometimes they're a little bit more simple. The Paul Newman one, to me, is a little bit more simple. It's just, something to do with what Ponyboy wants to be like. I did a little bit of research. I've never seen a Paul Newman movie personally, and it seems that the book's obviously set in the early 1960s in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it seems that there were 2 or 3 possible Paul Newman movies that this could have been that Ponyboy had gone to see in the theaters. Now, if you wanted to do some research about those specific movies and maybe pick 1 or 2 and say, like, hey, this is what these movies are about, this is what this has to do with The Outsiders, this is why Ponyboy says this, I think that could be a really strong paper. I think that could be a really unique paper if you wanted to go find those movies and either just look up some summaries of them or watch them yourself. I think that's an interesting approach because, again, it is cyclical. It starts the book, it ends the book. Very first and very last lines. So Paul Newman, as we know, is kind of the traditional masculine male hero type. He's that rugged, handsome, tough guy style. Clean shaven, like tough jawline, things like that. Ponyboy says he looks tough, not T-U-F-F, not what that slang word Ponyboy used for cool, but like tough as in strong, somebody you wouldn't want to mess with. And Ponyboy says that he wants to look like him, and I think implied in that's that maybe he wants to be kind of like him. Maybe he wants to be that, that dairy type, that big, strong, traditional masculine guy. So I think that's a possibility for an essay topic. Obviously, the essay topic is something to do with intertextuality, but again, he mentions it twice, and it's the same line. It's just repeated. Great Expectations is the one I forgot to mention, I believe, when we were starting the book. It's been so long, I'm not absolutely sure that I didn't mention it, but it's in chapter 1. He mentions that he felt like Pip in Great Expectations. I have read this book. You guys have a little bit of familiarity with Dickens from A Christmas Carol. We read the play version, not the novella, which is a short novel. And this is Great Expectations is Dickens' coming-of-age novel. It's a Bildungsroman from 1861. It's about 550 pages. It's a pretty good book. It's a little bit slow in places, which is how I feel about most of Dickens' work. It focuses on a young boy named Pip. He starts off the novel. He's poor. He lives with his sister and her husband. He's not very happy with his life circumstances. He dreams of being rich. He dreams of being a gentleman and all the things that would come with that. By the end of the novel, he's achieved that. The title, Great Expectations, he has these great expectations for himself, and he ends up achieving most of it, but there are, of course, a lot of ups and downs and surprising twists along the way that I won't get into because you'll probably read the book one day in high school or college. So Ponyboy empathizes with the young Pip. We don't mention the older one that gets kind of everything he'd asked for, ends up a rich man, and in a lot of ways changes as a person. But Ponyboy empathizes specifically with young, poor Pip, I think is how he phrases it, who's unhappy with his poverty. He's not happy with the fact that he's not a gentleman. He doesn't have this social status. And this kind of echoes the whole Gone with the Wind thing, where he and Johnny are enamored with the Southern gentleman. Johnny more with their heroic nature. Ponyboy, again, with the manners, that social status that they have. It seems like Pony's kind of like Pip in this way, in that he kind of dreams of transcending the kind of the shackles of poverty and being a greaser. It's almost like we've said, Ponyboy would kind of fit in with the socials if he really tried, and if he had the money, if he had parents, so I think this could be another good one. This one might be a bit difficult to do without reading a little bit of the book. You could probably look up some chapter summaries from the first few chapters and get a good idea of what Pip's life was like. I think that would probably work. And again, this is another Bildungsroman, much like The Outsiders. It's a coming-of-age novel, a novel about someone growing up and getting older and changing. So I think this could be a pretty good paper topic as well. But again, it's one reference on page 15. It's one of the less referenced examples of intertextuality in the book, but I do think this one echoes pretty strongly. There are some similar themes in both novels. Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost is the one that I think quite a few of you will probably pick, which is fine. It's first mentioned on page 77, and that's where it's quoted in its entirety. And I've got a couple other pages there where it's mentioned. It may be mentioned a few other times, but I think those are the primary three. It's a short poem, less than a page long. It's by Robert Frost, who we're familiar with. We read him in class a good bit. He's a very good American poet. I like him a lot. And the poem basically talks about the temporary nature of things that are good, things that are gold. It says, "Nothing gold can stay." That's the title. And it refers to nature's green and sunsets and all that sort of thing. And it's talking about how all these good things pass away, how they're temporary, how you can't hang on to them and make them stay, which is another of the major themes of the novel, that good things don't always last. And Ponyboy first quotes the whole thing on 77 when he and Johnny are watching a sunset outside the abandoned church after Johnny's killed Bob. And then Johnny's last words to Ponyboy. So Johnny hangs on to this poem the whole book. It's obvious that it strikes him when Pony quotes it on 77, but we don't realize how important it was until he's hit with his dying words. He says, "Stay gold, Ponyboy, stay gold," which again are some of the most famous dying words in young adult literature. So this is obviously something that was very important to Johnny. It's important to Pony because he can quote it word for word. And it's what Johnny chooses to say as he dies. And in his letter to Pony that we get to read towards the end of the novel, Johnny mentions the poem. He asks Pony to share it, or at least the idea of it, with Dally, of course not knowing that Dally's died. He asks him, to get him to look at a sunset, basically, to get him to appreciate those temporary things. But also there's that idea that he tells Ponyboy to stay gold. It's almost like Johnny's willfully missing the point of the poem. He's telling him, you shouldn't be one of those gold things that can't stay. You should find a way to stay the way you are, to stay good, to stay liking sunsets and books and poems and things. So it's interesting what Johnny takes from it and how different that probably is than maybe what the poem actually means and maybe what Ponyboy takes from it. All right, so Gone with the Wind is the other big one. This is a novel that I have not personally read. I plan to fix that maybe later this year. It's roughly 1,000 pages. It was written by Margaret Mitchell in 1936. It was a bestseller, remains a bestseller. The movie came out, I think, in 39. It was extremely famous. The movie's probably more famous than the book. It was the best-selling movie as far as theater tickets of all time up until the Titanic in the 90s. Still, I think, one of the top 10 or 15 best-selling movies ever. And it's mentioned, as you can see, in a lot of different places. The first time, I believe, is on page 71. And I'm not going to even begin to claim that I've hit every time it's mentioned because it's mentioned a lot. And Pony and Johnny read it in that abandoned church. They use it as a form of entertainment, kind of like playing poker to pass time. And later on, Johnny asked for his own copy of it to read in the hospital. So it's obvious that, again, this had a huge impression on him. These things like remembering the poem and internalizing its meaning and wanting to read the book again on his own, these things show us that Johnny's got a lot more going on than we first suspected, which is another of Hinton's kind of themes and ideas in the novel, that you can't judge a book by its cover, you can't judge people by first impressions. And she does a good job of showing that Pony is a little bit blind as to people's true natures a lot of the times, like with Two-Bit not just being a jokester, with Johnny not just being kind of this dopey, distant kid. He's actually pretty inclined to literature. He likes to read. He remembers things that he's told about reading. So it's pretty interesting, the point that she makes with that. But they're both enamored with that image of the gallant Southern gentleman, the noble gentleman riding into battle. Pony, of course, like I said, he's enamored with the mannerisms, the stately character that they present, basically the richness of them, which is very social-like. But he compares them to Soda, with Soda's charm and manners. And Johnny compares them to Dally because of their bravery, because of their lack of fear. And Pony ends up kind of admitting later on in the book, and comparing them to Johnny as well when he receives Johnny's version of the novel. Johnny leaves him the copy after he dies, and Ponyboy says, that he couldn't finish it. There's no way he'd get past the gallant Southern gentleman because he'd be thinking of Johnny and Dally, and he wouldn't be able to think about which one of them died gallantly, because you could argue that both of them do in a way. So he ends up comparing them to both Johnny and Dally. Therefore, Johnny kind of achieves that ideal that he set out for, at least in Ponyboy's eyes. And again, it's interesting that Ponyboy says, that he doesn't think he'd be able to finish the book. As far as we know, he doesn't finish it. We don't get anything to tell us that later on he went back and read Gone with the Wind or anything like that. So to our knowledge, it's left unfinished. We don't know if Johnny finished it or not. It seems slightly unlikely with him ailing in the hospital, not probably being a great reader, and it being a 1,000-page book. It seems unlikely that either of them read it in its entirety. But that's kind of part of the point, I think. They don't read the whole book. They don't get the whole message. They focus in on that one idea. And I think that's part of their youth. And I think that's part of their upbringing, the fact they get obsessed with this one specific idea. So that would be another good one. I think Nothing Gold Can Stay and Gone with the Wind are obviously the easiest two choices for this, although I hope some people do the other three. So the last one is Jack London's books. I think I referenced this very briefly. This is another one-off. This is mentioned in The Rumble, where the Greasers and the Socias fight. It's just a general reference. He doesn't even call the book by name, although I'm pretty sure he's referencing either Call of the Wild, White Fang, or both. And you guys have read Call of the Wild, so you should be familiar enough with that one to make some references and to understand the reference. Some of you, I think, have read White Fang. They're pretty similar books. They should really both be read together. They're kind of companions that tell opposite versions of the same story. Call of the Wild, is a dog moving to nature, whereas White Fang is a wolf becoming tame and becoming part of civilization. So he uses it to describe the way the boys are circled around the people getting ready to fight. I think it's Derry and Paul there at the beginning. And it's the way the wolves and, the dogs in Call of the Wild circle two fighters, waiting for one to fall so that they can all jump in. It's this comparison that kind of brings the book's man versus society conflict to this really basic man versus nature thing. It's kind of reduces the conflict down to the bare, fight or flight, survive or kill instinct thing that Jack London focuses so much on his novels. And I think that's an interesting point. I think it's a really strange reference, honestly, because so much of the book has been focused on this man versus society conflict and the internal conflicts that Ponyboy has with himself, which a lot of you pointed out when I asked you to write about conflict and antagonists and things, which I thought was good. And I think both of those are valid. So Ponyboy's got a lot of conflict with himself, so do all the characters, but there's also that obvious threat of man versus society going on. And then he makes this comparison that brings in nature, and it's such a weird reference. But when you think about nothing gold can stay and the sunsets and all that, there's something with nature going on, because sunsets are mentioned so much. There's such a motif in the book with Johnny and Cherry Valance and Ponyboy all talking about them. Johnny wanting Dally to look at one. There's such a strong repeated image in the book that I feel like there's something extra going on with nature there that you could probably explore that Hinton just barely hints at here with London. But anyway, I'm going to scroll down to the essay prompt. You're basically going to pick one of those things, okay? And you should be able to either write down some notes or take pictures of the screen to get my notes on each of those things, and you can go more in depth on the one you pick, obviously. But your prompt is to pick an example of intertextuality in The Outsiders. That's any of the 5 things above. If you can find one that I didn't find, email me or post a message on Classroom and tell me about it, because there's a possibility that I missed one, but I don't think I did. So pick an example and explain its importance to the novel's themes, Ponyboy's character development, the novel's plot, or any and all of the 3. So this is pretty open-ended. You basically pick an example of intertextuality and tell me why it's used, why it matters. As far as themes and ideas, that's a little bit deeper. Ponyboy's character development's relatively deep, and the novel's plot, I think, is pretty simple. So I just want you to tell me in what way your example affects one or all these things. And yes, you have to pick one example. You can't do Gone with the Wind and Nothing Gold Can Stay. But you could talk about the plot, Ponyboy's character, and the themes of the novel if you wanted to. You can talk about 2 of those 3 things. You can focus on one of them. I would probably focus on one, but that's totally up to you, and that aspect isn't necessarily going to affect your grade. It would just help you, I think, focus your argument a bit better. So you should develop a 3-point thesis that serves as a 1-sentence response to this prompt over the weekend. So Monday's homework is going to be to post that 3-point thesis. And I'm probably going to have you post it as a public response, and I'm probably also going to ask that you give feedback to at least 2 of your classmates on their thesis. I think we're going to do that so that we can workshop those a little bit. Again, constructive feedback. It doesn't have to be nice, but it does need to be constructive. Final draft Wednesday, May 7th. I'll turn it in. That's a little over a week and a half, about 2 weeks. Essay should be done in MLA with a works cited page. You have to cite The Outsiders at least. And if you want to cite, like if you use Gone with the Wind or Great Expectations or Call of the Wild or something like that, or if you use Call of the Wild and White Fang, you can cite those sources. That's fine. Like if you wanted to pull a quote or 2 from your secondary source to show how it affects The Outsiders and what you think The Outsiders is drawing from it, or if you wanted to, pull in a quote from a Paul Newman movie or something, I think that would work. And then you would need to cite that as a secondary source. But if you just use the references made to it in The Outsiders, you can get by just citing The Outsiders, and that'll work. So let's see, anything else that's important? Grading, I'm mainly going to focus on argument and structure since, we're not doing rough draft, then final draft. I'm not as worried about your formatting and your spelling and grammar. You will lose points if they're bad, but at this point, with you typing it up, they shouldn't be. I'll probably open submissions for those. We can go ahead and start submitting towards the middle of next week, and we'll gradually work on this and build it up, so don't feel like you have to get a whole essay done over the weekend or anything. Just get your thesis, and make sure you check for my response where you tell me your general thoughts and opinions on The Outsiders. I hope you guys have enjoyed the book. I think you have. We will likely have an online version of what my test would have been for it next Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on which class you are. So be ready for that. If you got any questions about any of this or anything else, I'll scroll back up just so there's a last view of some of this. So if you needed to take a picture or screenshot, whatever. All right. See you guys.